Okay, well, welcome everyone. I'm Professor Jeremy Suri from the History Department in the LBJ School, and I'm just fortunate to be here today, as so many of us are. This is such a wonderful building. It really is extraordinary to be in here, and I believe we are one of the first public lectures, if not the first public lecture in here, as I think is appropriate. And it's my great honor to introduce to you the man who oversees the College of Liberal Arts, the man who makes sure that we are truly leading the world, and that we now have the best buildings as well as the best scholars and the best students. Please join me in welcoming Dean Randy Deal.
Thanks, Jeremy. Before I begin, I want to recognize the class from the St. Catherine's Montessori School. We have undergraduates, graduate students, faculty, and a middle school attending today's lecture. Before I introduce our honored speaker, I want to thank Scott Noble. Scott, would you stand so people can see you? For his tremendous support in making this event possible, and for your dedication to training our next generation of national leaders by exposing them to a broad range of serious analytical viewpoints represented by our nation's thought leaders. Prominent among those thought leaders is today's speaker, former Secretary of Education, William Bennett, who I'm proud to say is a graduate of our college's PhD program in philosophy. He studied under John Silver, I learned today. That education has helped to inform his work as a respected scholar, political theorist, and public servant. The author of 20 books, he hosts the radio talk show Morning in America and appears regularly on CNN. Dr. Bennett is proof that our university creates leaders that change the world. He has held several cabinet-level positions, including Secretary of Education under President Ronald Reagan and Director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy under President George H.W. Bush. Dr. Bennett is also the chairman of K-12 Incorporated, an online education company, and he is a senior advisor to Project Lead the Way, which is one of the nation's leading providers of training and curriculum to improve STEM education in U.S. schools. Today, he will discuss education policy and the American future. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Bill Bennett.
Dean, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Try that again. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you very much. Great to be here. Great to be in Texas. I have a suit. Okay, now that's that. Probably treat it better. I have to get it back by 7 o'clock. And one day that was true. When I was a graduate student here, Dean, I lived at 2513 and a half Rio Grande. I didn't know there was such a thing as a 13 and a half, but I found it in Texas along with insects in the middle of the night. Anyway, I was a graduate student in philosophy and was grateful for my stipend of $900 a year, on which I lived, and rent, room, board, everything. Ate once a day at some place called El something, Chico, Taco, Cheapo, something, and ate a meal, all-you-can-eat meal, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Didn't do any wonders for me, as you can see, and it was mostly refried beans, I think. I don't think there was a lot of other stuff, but survived it and had a wonderful time in Texas. Got a wonderful education. Was a tutor and teaching assistant in Plan 2, which is one of the splendid programs in American education. And I say that because I'm a critic of American higher education, and I have a book coming out which will be very critical of American higher education. You can rest assured University of Texas Plan 2 are among the bright spots. So it's wonderful to be back. I came from the East. I went to Williams College. I grew up in New York City. I love Texas so much that I tried to see the whole state, which is not easy. My roommate and I drove one night to have dinner in El Paso. We had no idea. And we ended up at a place called Junction. Little fan going over, we stopped, ordered chicken fried steak, as was always the custom. And fellow behind the counter said, "You boys from the university?" I said, "It's so obvious." "So what are you doing out here?" We said, "Looking around." He said, "Yeah, you're from the university." Nobody looks around out here unless they're from the university. So he said, "Well, what are you doing?" I said, "We said we're just checking out things." He said, "Hear about the fellow down the road? He got on the telephone, called the operator, said, I want to call New York City." The operator said, "That'll cost you $4.20. $4.20 that I can call hell for a dime." I said, "Yes, sir, that's a local call." But I love Texas. I loved it. I still do. I love Big Bend. Love it all. And our son, my wife is here with me, named Bennett. Our son is at Combs Business School. And he went to Princeton, came to Texas, and had the same transformative experience I had. Threw away all that Northeastern stuff and garbed the burnt orange. So it's great to be back. Thank you, Dean. I thank you, Professor Suri. I was calling you Dean Suri all week, all month, and I'm sorry about that.
You never should be said.
Yeah, well, no. Listen, I understand the academy. You remember when Daniel Patrick Moynihan introduced me, my first job in Washington, the Democrat senator from New York, who was running. He was challenged by Jim Buckley, conservative Republican. In their first debate, Jim Buckley referred to Senator Moynihan as Professor Moynihan. Moynihan said, "Aha, the mudslinging starts early." So I do understand these things. Professors are promotion, right?
Yes, yes.
Good luck to you. So anyway, I'm not going to talk much about higher ed. I want to talk about elementary and secondary, which is my real passion. I have great interest in higher ed, but elementary and secondary is where I think the country decides its future. Life is a race between education and catastrophe. H.G. Wells said, "Americans believe in education," and I believe that race is still on. Come on in. Look at all these wonderful students. Great. Isn't it odd that we think it odd that students would come to a lecture on education? So why not? Please, come in. You will not be called on if you sit in the front row. Yeah, come on.
Come on up. I'll stand.
Let me just give an overview, some numbers in education, and some facts, and some things you may know, may not know, as a way of trying to prime the pump for our Q&A, which I hope is the main part of our conversation. We have about 50 million students in America in K through 12, some of them here. We have 6 million in private schools. We have about 2 million in charter schools, which is a growing phenomenon in American life, public charter schools. We have now about 2 million students who are homeschooled, and that is a growing trend in American education. We spend a lot of money on K through 12, about $525 billion a year. Per year, if you look at the average expenditure per student, we've been spending more and more. In constant 2009 dollars, we spent about $3,400 in 1960, about $6,800 in 1980, and about $12,000 per student per year in the year 2011. If you're interested in higher education, we have about 20 million students, and we spend about $400 billion a year. Average public university tuition runs about $12,000 a year. Average private university tuition runs about $30,000 a year. What do we get for $1 trillion a year? We don't know at the level of higher education because we don't assess and evaluate. We know some things. We know that we have the world's greatest universities. We know that people want to come here. If there's any test in people wanting to come to the U.S., then certainly we're the best. I used to say one test of a country is the Gates test. That is, if you raise up the gates, which way do people run? Do they run in or do they run out? In America, when you raise them up, they run in. If you don't raise them up, they run in. Sometimes it slows. But in American higher education, that's certainly the case. We are where America wants to go to graduate school, for sure. Elementary and secondary performance, however, is another story. When we assess our students against students from other industrialized nations, we get the following. This is from the third international assessment of math and science and PISA assessments, international assessments. Our fourth grade students finish about 9th in the industrialized world. Our 8th grade students about 12th, and our high school students about 25th. The longer you stay in school in America, the dumber you get relative to kids in other industrialized nations, and that for $525 billion a year. It's not good. In science, 4th grade, we're 7th, 8th grade, we're 13th, and in 12th grade, we're 17th. We lose ground as we progress. But note what's interesting here. It's not students. The students perform well at the early levels. It's not genetic. It's not in the water. It's not in the brains of Americans. It's something in the system. If you look at it by state, it comes out differently. Some states do better than others. North Carolina's improved a lot. Florida's improved. Massachusetts, by itself, performs almost at world-class levels pretty much throughout. We can talk about why later. Things are slowly getting better, but they're not getting better fast enough. What do we know about what works in American education? We know, first of all, that the single most important teacher in a child's life is the parent. Not all teachers are parents, but all parents are teachers, or the all but indispensable teacher. If parents take a great interest in their children's education, it is likely, the research shows, and common sense, that kids will get smarter and do better. Outside of parents, teachers are the indispensable element, the second most important factor. More important than schools, more important than facilities, more important than spending, quality of teachers, quality of the instructor. A lot of research has been done on this lately. Let me tell you the most important research. Sanders and Rivers at South Carolina and Tennessee, and they did this research again at UCLA, found the following. If you take, well, remember one statistic, this is the one I remember. If you take students in the 3rd grade at the 50th percentile, right in the middle, and you give them 3 years of teachers adjudged to be effective teachers, judged to be by peer assessment and other measures, after 3 years, those students will average in the 90th percentile. If you take those students in the 50th percentile and give them poor teachers, after 3 years, those students will average the 37th percentile. Is there anything more you need to know about the importance of teachers and what difference good teaching makes? Problem is, we're not exactly sure how to identify good teachers early on. There are different notions of what makes for a good teacher. If we do evaluate based on performance, student performance, peer evaluation, peer group, we do seem to get agreement after 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. But right up front, we're not sure how to know. We do have some indicators that suggest teachers who have mastery of a subject matter content, that is an actual subject, math, English, history, science, and who are themselves very well read and who go about their tasks energetically, are more effective teachers. That would seem to be almost tautologous. Eric Hanishak at Stanford has done some very interesting research and suggests the following. He said if we could encourage the bottom 6 to 10% of our teaching force, the bottom 6 to 10%, to leave and go into another profession, he said, and just replace them with average teachers, it would put the U.S. in the top 10 internationally across the board. That's the difference, replacing the bottom with just average, not great, but average teachers. It suggests there may be reasons to have more mobility and more encouragement in and out of the profession for different people. In saying all this, of course, it doesn't mean to say there aren't great schools in America. There are great schools in America. I have visited probably 600 schools. It started, my wife encouraged me. When I became Secretary of Education, she said, Mrs. Bennett said, I don't just stand there and make your pronouncements, go find out what you're talking about first. I said, why should I be different from everybody else in the cabinet? And she said, because you're the Secretary of Education, do your homework. So often I went to schools. I went to about 130 schools, good schools, bad schools, great schools, horrible schools. And I developed a pretty good judgment about schools. I've now been to about 600. And there are schools you would go to which will encourage you greatly. George Eliot says, excellence is important because it encourages you about life generally. You go to a great school and you're encouraged about life generally. It has a feel about it. It has an ethos to it. You go to a bad school and your knuckles get white and you want to jump up in the middle of the session and say things. But there's a great variation in our schools, and our students are either the beneficiaries or the victims. If you're interested in looking at your school, your district, there is now a website put out by Jay Green, the University of Arkansas. It's called the Global Report Card. It's globalreportcard.org, is that right, Chris? And you go there and you plug in your district. It may have information on your school, probably just your district, and it will tell you where it ranks internationally. I checked Travis County just for fun, 65th, so almost the top third in math, and 59th in reading. I checked Montgomery County, where we used to live in Maryland, 57th in math, and 65th in reading. It's based on state scores, NAEP, the National Assessment of Education Progress, and some international assessments. Anyway, great variation. Does that mean it makes a great deal of difference where you go to school? It can, but a greater difference, again, point of emphasis, is who your teachers are. It is better to go to a bad school and have 2 great teachers or 3 great teachers than to go to a school that has a great reputation and have poor teachers. Is there a teacher shortage? In general, no. Emphatically no. Are there shortages in some subjects, disciplines? Yes. Does it seem like there's a teacher shortage? Yes, because there are artificial limits on supply. There are a lot of young people who want to be teachers, but there are limits put on their ability to enter the profession by people in the profession. One of the most remarkable organizations in the country is a group called Teach for America. Teach for America is, anybody familiar with it? A lot of people. You sign up if you're an undergraduate and you say you want to go teach. You usually go to some inner city school or someplace that's way out in the rural district somewhere. It's usually a poor district, and you go right out of college and into the classroom. If we took all of the talented kids, or most of the talented kids, excuse the expression, kids, young people, coming out of college who want to go to Teach for America, we would have probably an oversupply of teachers. But it's highly competitive. It's harder to get accepted. Is it warm in here? Are you warm too?
I'm over 40, it could be, I don't know.
Could be over 40, I'm just 40. It is warm, I just had a workout too, it was bad. I'm getting another one. Anyway, that's all right, it's fine. It is harder to get a Teach for America position than it is to get into Brown. It's very, very competitive. 18% of Harvard graduates last year applied to Teach for America. Would you have guessed that? Would you have guessed that almost a fifth of Harvard graduates wanted to join Teach for America? But only about a third of them made it, and were accepted. Same at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, my wife's alma mater. I'm sure the University of Texas, tons of students applying to Teach for America. Now, why not make it easier for young people like this to get in and teach for a couple of years? They know their subject, they have high standards, they have tremendous idealism and energy. There's resistance. The teachers' unions resist them, others resist. Jay Green said, I'd rather have them for 2, 3, 4 years because I would rather rent good teachers than hire bad ones. The argument is, well, a lot of them will leave after 3 or 4 years and go pursue an MBA. Well, fine. Take them for 3 or 4 years. We don't reject Marines, do we, because they only serve 4 years. We say, thanks very much for the 4 years. If you want to sign back up, go ahead. But 4 years of a great young teacher is a great thing. So it's a fine program, and programs like Teach for America, and there are some others, can address this issue or non-issue in most ways of teaching shortage. Now, A couple of things I want to mention, then I want to stop and get your comments, questions. Article in City Journal this month by E.D. Hirsch. Hirsch's work is the core knowledge, the core disciplines, the core books, the core knowledge workbooks. Very familiar to a lot of people, the literacy, core literacy workbooks. Hirsch has argued, there's extensive research, that the major problem, and I have felt this way for a long time, I haven't done the research, major problem in how we've been teaching the last 30 years, which accounts for our decline in scores, is that in the early grades we have a consensus about what to do and how to teach. As we get closer to 5th, 6th, 7th grade, that consensus breaks down. And when it breaks down, it goes into different schools of thought. The dominant school of thought, this is a generalization, but I think it's true, over the last 30 years, it's been that of formalism, or kind of progressivism, which suggests, and you've heard this as a cliche, it's not so important what you learn, so much as learning how to learn. Hirsch argues, and a lot of the scholarship now argues, this is bunk. You must learn how to learn by learning. The way to learn how to learn is to learn something. Domain-centered learning, content-centered learning. He says, he goes so far to say in this article, that it's only domain-centered learning, learning biology, learning the relationship between plants and photosynthesis and the sun and old soil and water, that you develop a good vocabulary and those cognitive abilities. And he says a good vocabulary is the clear and distinct advantage of most people who succeed. He argues that that's what you get from domain learning. Let me just quote him. He says, student vocabulary size in grade 12 will predict graduation rates and levels of income for the rest of your life. It doesn't mean you get those little cards and sit there with your mom or dad, as we did, and say, okay, this word, that word. That might help, but you need to know what the word means in context, as the photosynthesis example suggests. Vocabulary size is a proxy, Hirsch says, for a whole range of abilities, and it's important to learn that content first. The way to learn how to learn is to start by learning something, and it can be almost anything the child develops an interest in, provided it is something that can increase in sophistication, that can increase his powers of reasoning, that attracts higher order skills, develops higher order skills, rather than lower order skills, provided he can get something wrong and then correct it and get something right. This is a very hot topic in educational circles and is being debated, but Hirsch has put his marker down and we shall see where it goes. I remember when I went to France as Secretary of Education, I visited with Mr. Chevènement, Minister of Culture, and I said, how are the French students doing? And he said, it is 10 o'clock. They're all reading their Racine. And the American students, I said, God knows. Anything and everything. Math, calculus, recess, you name it. We're doing it all right now. Highly decentralized system. That the French have moved away from that system. The systems that have these, what are regarded as rigidly structured hierarchical systems, when the systems everybody likes to beat up on with lots of memorization, lots of reading, lots of content, are the ones that are working, and the ones that are producing the best. When I went to the Far East and visited schools in South Korea and other places, Hong Kong, you can see this. They're not pretty in terms of what's going on in the classroom. Classrooms are big, they're tough, they're rigorous, but they're learning. There are also huge cultural differences. Professor Stevenson at Michigan has pointed out, to oversimplify, but it's true. If you can't do math well in America, your parents tend to say, I couldn't do math, Aunt Gladys couldn't do math, your grandmother couldn't do math, you can't do math. In Hong Kong they say, study harder, work harder. When I was secretary visiting schools around the country, the Orange County Vietnamese Parents League invited me out for a speech, and the day before I was to come, the Honorable Secretary of Education, as they kept calling me. They made it sound right, too, the Honorable Secretary. They called me up and canceled me because there was a math test the next day. They said, not a single parent will be at your lecture because there's a math test the next day. Again, importance of parents and culture in the mix. Okay, how do we fix American education? No quick fix, but I think a number of the things that we've been talking about for 20 or 30 years now in public policy can have something to do with it in a positive way. Encourage people into teaching, even if it's for a few years. See what works. If content-based education, domain-centered education, domain knowledge-centered education works, let's do it. I think school choice ought to be encouraged. I think charters ought to be encouraged. But I think all of these options, charters, choice, homeschool, need to be assessed and evaluated on a rigorous basis and on a basis of an equal playing field. It is interesting in homeschooling, which is a growth phenomenon in America. I was surprised to see how many people on the coasts in LA and in New York, and I'm sure in Austin, given the high-tech culture here, 2 young high-tech parents taking a year or 2 years off at a time, alternating who does the homeschooling for the kids. It's a new age kind of phenomenon, but it is interesting when you test the homeschool kids. They tend to test 30 to 40% better than their public school counterparts or private school counterparts. Now, this, I don't know what this proves. It's not easy to know exactly what it proves. It certainly proves that you can learn at home as well as anywhere else. It may also prove that you cannot pay someone to do what a parent will do out of love forever and ever until you get it right, including the science project, which we had in our house. It seemed endlessly. It seemed like we always had hamsters in the attic doing something. That's a story we can do in the Q&A if you want. Anyway, parents will do this out of love. But I think at least we're now in America willing to be open about some more options. And I think a lot of the interests in education, a lot of the people who have been trying to control education, teachers' unions, some of the administrative groups, some of the educational experts are yielding more in the direction of allowing more pluralism, trying more options. We're also much better at assessment and evaluation than we've ever been, so it's kind of unavoidable that people will say, well, if this doesn't work, why don't we try something else? A few topics that I think will dominate conversation over the next few years: teacher evaluation and teacher preparation, for the reasons I've just mentioned. As the central importance of the teacher becomes more obvious to people, I think we're going to see a lot more emphasis on teacher preparation, teacher recruitment, and accountability. Second is the so-called Common Core. This is the notion of a common curriculum for all Americans, developed out of the states, encouraged by the U.S. Department of Education, and suggesting, at least in areas such as language arts, English, and math, that there ought to be something of a common culture, contributions, of course, from the diversity that is American life, but basically a common language in mathematics, in literacy, and in numeracy. We'll see what happens when we get to history. That's a harder one, as Professor Suri knows. There are other questions in regard to the future of education, such as paying the bill, paying the pensions, and the like. One other topic, two other topics I'll mention, and then you'll have plenty to choose from. One is higher ed, and that's the subject of the book that I'll be putting out in May. I believe higher ed is on the verge of a major revolution. And I think the technology is the major cause of that revolution. You may have heard of MOOCs, massive open online courses. They are making their way in American education, and it's quite extraordinary. I'll just tell you one story about MOOCs. Full disclosure, I'm on the advisory board of a company called Udacity, founded by a man named Sebastian Thrun, a German immigrant to the U.S., went to Stanford and to Google, became vice president of Google, invented several robots and a driverless car, which sounds like a good idea to me as the father of former teenagers. I don't know how it works. But anyway, he was teaching a course in robotics to graduate students at Stanford, about 400 students, and he decided to put it online. The next thing that happened, there were 14,000 students and then 142,000 students. And he said to his Stanford colleagues, "Isn't this great? Everybody's taking this course at Stanford now." The administrator said, "We're not so sure. We haven't seen their tuition receipts," or something like that. I don't mean to be cynical about it. They said, "We got to figure this out. You can't just make this stuff available to everybody." He said, "Well, why not?" He said, "Well, it's proprietary. This is Stanford. You know, people come here, they pay good dollars to get this course, and you can't just ship it to everybody." He said, "Well, I'm shipping it to everybody." Anyway, he finally stepped down. His relations with Stanford are good, and Stanford is now getting involved in this. Two very interesting things happened. One, of the 400 students who were taking the course, a third of them dropped the in-person course to take it online. Now, only you students understand this. I don't understand this. I'm too old. But these digital natives, these young people, said, "We prefer the intimacy of the online course to the person standing in the lecture hall, the community that develops with this course." The second thing that happened, and this is the one that really shook Stanford, and Stanford's a pretty good school. It's not as good as its football team, but it's a damn good school. Texas, pay attention to that. Anyway, you remember we won a university equal to our football team. Yeah, they're working on that at Oregon and Tuscaloosa, but Stanford, they're pretty close. Of the 140,000 students who took the course online, they gave a test, and it wasn't until something like 420 that one of the Stanford students showed up. Number one student was a student from Mongolia. 16-year-old from Mongolia was taking the course. Now, you talk about an instrument for cognitive search and identification of talent. This is a remarkable way to find talent. Every country in the world, by the way, had people taking this course except North Korea, which, you know, they can't do that. You've got to block access. Where that will lead, I don't know. But this guy's a crusader. So are the people in a group called Coursera and edX. They plan to transform American higher education. This particular gentleman has signed a contract with the state of California to offer all the remedial education that needs to be done at the community college level online for not $1,500 a course, but $100 a course. So you see the economics of this. I think the implications of this will be enormous. Now, if none of this has been provocative enough, let me give you one more set of numbers, and you can decide whether you want to talk about it or not. Men are falling way behind in American education. If they keep going at this rate, they will disappear in about 50 years. I don't think they'll disappear, but it doesn't look good. 58% of undergraduate degrees this year will go to women, the BAs, and almost as many in the master's and now in the doctoral programs. This country decided it wasn't treating its women right, decided to, encourage women to do their best, and they have. And they are running circles around the men at many of the most selective colleges and universities in the country. I can't get deans of admissions to go on the record, but they've told me privately if we did it just on the records, just on the scores, we'd be 80% women. The men are falling behind for reasons very complicated. But if you look at it, it's 58% at Chapel Hill of the graduates this year will be women, 42% men. If you look at the historically black colleges and universities, it's about 70% women and about 30% men. Hispanic numbers are about in the middle between those two. That's a cultural factor of some significance. Anyway, education in America is changing. There's promise, there's hope. There's a lot going on. The debate is engaged. I am more optimistic about change than I've been in a long time, but we have a long way to go, and the world is a very challenging place, and our students are now competing with students from all over the world. There's a menu. What would you like to talk about? Thank you very much.
Secretary Bennett, I will just play a traffic cop. You have certainly given us plenty of material to chew on. But as traffic cop, I'll also ask the first question while others think of their questions. I have many students, some are in the audience here, I see them, and thank you for coming. You all get extra credit for being here. I have many students who share your desire to transform education in the United States, particularly at the K through 12 level. And almost every week, a student comes to my office and says, I want to do something, I want to change education. What should I do? What should I answer?
Well, teach. People thought that when I was Secretary of Education, people said, can you just kind of push a button and change American education? No, maybe if you were in France in the old days or some centralized country, you could do that. All right, I have just issued an edict. But I issued edicts all the time. Nobody paid any attention to me. I mean, I didn't issue edicts. I would just say, why don't we do this? And people would say, that's nice. Have a nice day. I remember we were trying to figure out why some of our policy changes hadn't been implemented a year after I took office. And I went down and I found out that kind of like a ship's captain, I was steering the wheel. The wheel wasn't connected to anything. I had 8,000 people working for me in the Department of Education, but they weren't listening to a thing I was saying. You know, when I came in, they'd say, very nice to see you, we'll go on as before. But you don't change it from Washington. You can encourage the right things from Washington. And I think this secretary, I'm not of this team, this group that's in Washington, but I think this Secretary of Education has done some things that are pretty good and made some good sense and got in some of the right fights. But the bully pulpit is what that Secretary of Education can do. If you really want to change education, you can be a teacher. You can start a school. You can become a principal, which is a very important person in a school. But I go back to Thomas More in Man for All Seasons. He says to Roper, or Richard Rich, it's not Roper, it's Richard Rich. He says to Richard Rich, turns out to be a bad dude. He says, Rich, be a teacher. And Rich says, why? And Thomas More says, you'd be a good one. And Rich says, if I were, who would know it? And Thomas says, you, your students, their parents, and God. Not a bad public, that. A better public than a lot of people who graduate, go sit in a cubicle somewhere for 15 years and wonder whether they're making any difference. Look, I think we should make teaching a lot more attractive profession. I think we should pay our good teachers more, even a lot more. And we should, wait a minute. There's a conjunctive. And we should take our poor teachers and get them out of the classroom as soon as possible. And that is very, very hard to do. But, in all the schools I visited, I always went to the school and went to the teacher room and talked to the teachers. And I would always say, who's the best teacher in the math department? And teachers would say, well, there's Jack, there's Harry, there's Jane. I never heard a group of teachers say, we don't have any idea. We really just totally have no idea. These are things you know. Teachers know it. People in the school know it. Parents often know it. People can be wrong about this too. That's why I think you should have assessments that are fair and reasonable. We were talking about it at breakfast this morning. Teachers should be evaluated by their peers, should be evaluated by the results their students get, and by other means or measures. But that's a way to make a difference. I've known young people who got out, decided to go into educational research. I know people who started charter schools. I know people who worked at foundations. There's a lot of levers out there. Yes. Are there any students at the middle school who have any questions? No math questions.
Oh, we have one now. Yes. Maybe identify yourself for us briefly. Stand up.
Hi.
I was wondering how Montessori school compared to public and private and homeschooling and all.
I don't have the data on Montessori schools. They're very much favored by a lot of parents. A lot of parents really like the Montessori approach, and it's a very interesting set of propositions. I don't know where they end up in terms of being on the scale. I will tell you this: the much stated difference between private schools, parochial schools, public schools is overstated. There's not as much difference as one would think. The differences are among good schools and bad schools, and they're of all types and styles.
Yes, sir.
I'm a business student at McCombs, and I really am encouraged by talk going around about how the private sector and business students can help the education sector. The dark side to this being the commodification of teaching, as in University of Phoenix, and downsides like that. But there are a lot of upsides as well. I'd like to hear kind of where you see the future of business contribution to education policy.
There's a very interesting business involvement in education now, which has been welcomed by some education reform, is not welcomed by others. And some of it is mischievous, some of it isn't. When a businessman steps forward and says, I got some ideas about how to improve American education. If you read your Texas newspapers, you will see a Texas businessman said, I know we got a Cadillac at the University of Texas, but why don't we make Chevy Bel Airs? He was dating himself, among other things. How about Impalas? How about Thunderbird? Am I so old? Nobody knows what I'm talking about. And educators say, whoa, what are you doing? Look, I think a lot of education could use some business sense, frankly. And first of all, in how you run a business, and how you use resources efficiently and in a way that's accountable. Understanding that you're in a very delicate environment. But, hospitals are a delicate business too. They try to make people well. They try to hope people don't die, and they've got to reach a bottom line. I think we do much better with a more of a business mentality. When I went to, let me give you a little longer answer on this because it fits. When I went to Chicago, the first time I went to Chicago, I said, did my homework, as my wife told me, and I said, these are the worst schools in the United States of America. And you're not supposed to do that. The Secretary of Education is supposed to say everything's great. And I admire so much what you're doing. Anyway, I looked at the scores, and I said, I think these are the worst schools in the United States of America. They called me 2 years later when the DC scores came out. They said, ha, you're worse now. I said, lucky us, good for both of us, huh? Anyway, when I made this statement at a press conference, this is true, the guy from the mayor's office stood up and said, I've been looking at the numbers. We are not the worst schools in America. Detroit has the worst schools in America. I said, good for you. Do not be guilty of low aspirations. Now, this is somewhat humorous, but it's not. Because when schools are that bad, kids are going nowhere. And these kids in the inner city are going nowhere. Chicago then had a 50% dropout rate. Of the kids who stayed in school, the bottom of the kids who stayed in school took a test on graduation. 40% of them were in the bottom 10% of the country. That's just disaster. So I said, this is a terrible system. They said, we have some great schools. I said, fine, let's go see one. He said, we'll give us a couple of weeks. We're going to find one. So we'll call you. They called me and said, we got one. I went back and I went to the LaSalle Language Academy. Inner city school, tough neighborhood, great principal, Amy Weissner. It was a magnet school, and mostly poor kids. And she had rules for the parents. You get them here on time with 8 hours of sleep. If you can't feed them, we will. No TV before they do their homework. We'll take care of everything else. So Amy was running this school. I spent the day at the school with the head school board. Fabulous place. I said, why does this place work? Why are the scores so good? He said, well, we picked Amy out. And we said, Amy, you're one of the best principals in the system. This is your school. You make it work. You hire the teachers you want. And you can pay them what you think you ought to pay. Here's your budget. You make it up as you want. And let this be a school of choice. Parents choose this. They know the rules. So I said, why don't you do this throughout the system? Think of your business background, okay? The head of the school board said, well, you just can't have Amy everywhere. I mean, if you only had people like Amy, you'd have to fire half the people in the system. Fire them. If you gave the Amys in the system the chance to hire their own teachers, a lot of teachers wouldn't be hired. I said, what do we got here? Soviet system? And if you gave parents choice, a lot of these parents, these inner city parents, wouldn't send their kids to these schools. They know there's nothing going on but drugs and crime and girls getting harassed and not much learning. Next week, the Chicago Tribune ran a story about a high school with a 100% dropout rate. A what? And now in business, if you have a 100% dropout rate, you know what you have? No business. It's gone, right. Not in the public school system. I told you I was a philosophy major, did my PhD here. I wondered about 100% dropout rate. Were they making announcements over the loudspeaker? George Carlin said, if a tree falls in the forest, does anyone hear it? If a man is alone in the forest, without his wife, is he still wrong? The answer is yes. I can tell you that. So this is shameful, this is embarrassing. So any basic business principles would have you doing things in a different way. Now, what pushes against this? Well, you got contracts, and you got tenure, and you got these pensions, and you got all sorts of things. But it's starting to push. It's starting to yield a little bit. I don't know if you saw this movie, Waiting for Superman. It was a very moving movie, and it took the side of parents. Now, I've had my fights with the unions. I've had my agreements with the unions. I don't like to make the unions the boogeyman here. But they have been resistant to this kind of change. And the unions will go mile after mile defending any teacher against almost anything. After I left the education job, I became the nation's first drug czar. Yeah, anti-drug czar, it should have been. Ridiculous title about it. A woman said, are you with the cartel or not with the cartel? And the only good thing about the title drug czar is I can refer to my wife as Zarling, and then two little boys as the Zardines. But I asked the teachers' unions, will you take a public position that teachers who use drugs shouldn't be in the classroom? They would not. Will you take a public position that teachers who use drugs with their students? We would not. Okay, how about we start somewhere? Any teacher who's selling drugs to her students is out. Wouldn't do it. So, you guys are just corrupt. You're just totally and completely corrupt. If you can't see that one. So that's kind of made me very, very, angry with the unions. And there's, I think, still a lot of resistance. But they are giving and they are yielding. But remember this, the teachers are a lot better often than their associations, in their organization. This is true in a lot of organizations. Puritans believed a community of sinners could make a great church. And sometimes in education, you think a community of some very, very dedicated people can end up with organizations which don't represent them well. So I think the move to a business sensibility about accountability, about the bottom line is a good thing. And I'll tell you what drives that now. Budgets. We went to a school, last point, in Dalzell, Illinois. So I'm sitting there as Secretary of Education, and I'm trying to find out what works. And I'm thinking, if it works somewhere, maybe it'll work somewhere else. I see the highest scores are in Dalzell, Illinois. I go out to Dalzell, Illinois. What happened? We had severe budget cuts. All we can teach is math, English, history, science, art, and music. We had to drop the sociology. We had to drop the Baja Whale Watch. We had to drop who do you think you are? What are you teaching? Math, English, history, science. Sounds pretty good to me. Yeah, we can't wait for that budget increase so we can get back to Baja Whale Watch. Well, maybe, this was a good focusing experiment, and there's more along those lines.
I want to bring in a question from...
Sorry to be long-winded, it was a great question.
I want to just move across the room so this gentleman will come.
I just wanted to follow up on my son was in Teach for America, and they did, in Watts, Compton, and they did great.
Where was he? Watts, Compton. Yeah, well, you can't get tougher than that.
They did an assessment, and they were doing a grade and a half promotion for every year compared to the other teachers. How do the teachers defend themselves? The other teachers are not teachers. These Teach America kids are bright, talented, energetic, and outperform, and yet they were getting treated horribly by the other teachers.
Well, I know. I frankly think in a lot of cases they'd say it, but I think these young people who are so bright, talented, idealistic are a threat to the people who are sitting there. My department chairman in philosophy said there's only one test for department chairman. Is he willing to hire people who are smarter than he is? He doesn't, his light doesn't have to shine the brightest. You're the department chair, you hire the best people you can because they make you look better. You don't have to be the king of the roost. But I think there is some of that. By the way, in this research by Sanders and Rivers, that's exactly the increment that's shown. The teachers at the top level do 1.5 to 2 years worth of work in that 1 year. And the teachers at the bottom level tend to do 1/3 of a year work in a year. That, after 3-4 years, it begins to add up. Yeah, they're not treated. Well, when I was reading about Jaime Escalante, the great teacher again, you're too young, most of you, but a movie called Stand and Deliver about this great math teacher at Garfield High School in L.A., immigrant from Bolivia, and he had the third highest number of calculus AP students. And I read about it. I went out there. I got the idea because the Secretary of Agriculture, there was a what is it in the hamburgers that makes them bad, toxic?
E. coli.
E. coli. I was thinking of something else. E. coli. And there was E. coli found in burgers in Portland. He's on a plane, Portland. Well, there's a school in Baltimore where no one's reading at grade level. I should be on the Amtrak, shouldn't I? Finding out what's going on if I'm supposed to be standing up for these kids. So I heard about Escalante doing this at Garfield High School. I think you need one to get one to that lady. I'm selling them for $5 for a school. It's a bake sale. You're baking and I'm selling. So I go out to see Escalante, and he's this amazing teacher. And I visit with the principal first, and she said, "Your visit to see Jaime is disruptive." I said, "Why is it disruptive?" "Well, the other teachers don't like it." I said, "Why?" They said, "Well, he's getting all this attention." I said, "Well, he's getting kids into AP calculus." I said, "Well, the other teachers don't like that." I said, "Are they getting kids into AP calculus?" "No." I said, "Well, too bad." Anyway, followed this guy around for 2 days. He was the best teacher I ever saw. And his kids in the barrio were number 3 in the country. They took the AP test in calculus, 18 of them, and they all passed. Princeton looked at the results, looked at the backgrounds, looked at their surnames, and said, "You're cheating." They made the kids take the test again. They did it again. So they gave them their AP. So he came, they made a movie, Stand and Deliver. He came to Washington. We had a great dinner. And, he had these math clubs, these math societies. And he said, the basketball coach at the high school goes into the elementary school and middle school, and he looks at the kids in the gym, and he picks them out. He says, "I go into 6th grade. I say, 'Hey, doing pretty good on this math here. I got a club you may want to join.'" Hilarious guy. And he said, "I bring my old students back." He said, Hispanic kids, 740 SATs. They go to Caltech, Texas. They go to A&M. Sorry, I got it. Well, you got to be fair. And and MIT. He said, "I bring them back," and I say, "Come back. Bring your best suit, and bring your beautiful girlfriend or your beautiful boyfriend, and bring your sports car, expensive sports car." Kid said, "I don't have an expensive sports car." He said, "Just rent an expensive sports car." Guy comes in, talks to the kids, drives off out of the parking lot. Escalante gets all the kids at the window, said, "See, there, look at that sports car, look at him. He was dumb. He wasn't as smart as you guys, is what you can do." That's a teacher. See, that's a teacher. He was fired from Garfield High School because he had 36 kids in his class in violation of state law, which says you can only have 31. So he ended up in Sacramento, where he was shot in a crossfire in a gang shooting. And the cops knew it was him because he was wearing his math jacket. Great man. Stand and Deliver. Rent the movie. It's Edward James Olmos. It's a fabulous movie.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Cersei Nylon. Thank you so much for being with us. In full disclosure, I'm a Teach for America alum.
Hey, good for you.
If anybody here is thinking about it, I would be happy to talk to you about it.
You seem happy, too.
I'm
Good.
happy to be here in Austin. I just moved here. And
Well, Austin makes everybody happy.
In further full disclosure, I'm a former staff member at Uncommon Schools, which is one of the leading charter networks
Yes.
on the East Coast.
Yes.
So I'm a charter supporter, and was very interested in your comments about the recent Hirsch
Yeah.
article. I want to ask a fairly narrow question about content at the middle and high school level, specifically for students who are learning English as a second language. When I did Teach for America, I taught not far from Garfield in East Los Angeles, and all my students were ESL students from Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, and they were all 13, 14, and very recent to the country. So when I think about Hirsch's argument about domain learning, that of course it's more compelling for a 13, 14 maturing young adult to learn about rich content
Yeah,
can be expanded
Yeah.
upon, and that's going to give you the vocabulary you really need. How is a teacher able to do that when the language skills are so nascent? That I was teaching a scripted curriculum mandated by the state of California, where I was teaching 13-year-old boys about magic carpet rides
yeah,
for some chapter
Right.
that we had to spend 4 days on. They didn't care about that because they were hungry to learn about real content
Yeah.
that their vocabulary wasn't ready for.
that's a great question, beautifully asked, so elegantly asked, I'm tempted to ask you to answer it.
I have some ideas. but
No, I'd like to hear, I have some ideas too, but I'd like, because you've thought about this, I can give you a quick answer, but I don't want to. Start your answer, what do you think?
Oh, gosh, that's
I'll tell you what I think,
Yeah,
and then you
you
do it.
start.
Because I don't think I know as much about this as you do. I was reading Hirsch pretty carefully and then some backup articles. And he says there's no short way around this. And I know what he says about the language stuff, which is get the language stuff done early. Get it done early. He's an immersion guy, and the more I went to the schools, the more I became such. And for the sake of the kids, get that facility in that language. Keep the language of home as well, but get them proficient as soon as possible. He uses as evidence the KIPP schools. You familiar with the KIPP schools? They're quite your age now, and they're good. They're very good. However, KIPP kids, KIPP academies, they're very intense. They almost look like these Japanese schools, 6 days a week.
And started in Houston.
Yes, it started in Houston. It's all over the country now, and their records are vary place to place, but generally very good. The graduation for the KIPP kids who go to college is only 30%, and he says it's the failure of the domain learning in the early years. That they catch up fast in math, which you can do with an Escalante, or you don't even have to have an Escalante, but you got to have that early vocabulary. You got to have that in the domain disciplines, because that's the thing that's going to serve you well later on. He said there's no shortcut here. So you either establish that early and enrich that curriculum early and build on it, or you're just doing the magic carpet. You want to say something? Can we get this lady just to...
Sure.
The one thing I'll say is we're forced to think about an individual's learning process in a K-12 or K-16 period of time. And so, if you get a 9th grader who is new to this country and learning English from scratch, it's all about how do we catch this kid up by 12th grade?
Well, that's right.
And I wonder if the conversation needs to be greatly expanded into what's going to serve this individual best over a lifetime that we hope will last
You got it.
80 to 90
You
years.
got it. You got
And
it.
if you're not proficient and you don't have
Yeah.
the base vocabulary to even engage in domain learning until you're 24, that's okay.
Get it right.
Because you're still going to have 50 years.
That's right. Get it right in the long
But
run.
we don't have a system that supports that type of learning.
Well, because I think there's a bias built into the system, which is to move it along as quickly as possible.
Yeah, well, we had social promotion
That's right.
in the school where I taught, which shocked me when I was there. It meant that even if you failed every class that you were in, if you failed my 7th grade English class, your math class, all of them, you still went to 8th grade.
Yeah, and you know what? This is it's very interesting. If you read someone like Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, you see all these pressures. A kid, immigrant child, move them along, get them up there. And what are the established upper classes doing? They're holding their kids back. Holding their kids back. We're going to repeat 1st grade. We'll repeat 2nd grade too. I remember our boys went to Princeton, guys in their class, freshman class, 21, 22 years old. My parents held them back a couple times. Why? Just get it right. Get it right before you move on. Life's a long run. You're going to live to be, 100. So what's the rush? Get it right. And I think, and as in all these things, I'm doing a lot of work in STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math, that a lot of the work now is being done in the middle schools. We got to drive it back to the elementary schools. We got to drive that interest back to the elementary schools. An awful lot of kids make up their minds against reading, against math, science, at 8 and 9 years old. That's just crazy, because they haven't been exposed to it the right way, and life's a long run.
I think this lady wanted to have a follow-up question.
It's actually not a question, but just more of a comment
Sure.
on a lot of what's being said. I am a Montessori teacher, and my first thing that I'll say about Montessori is that not all Montessori schools are truly following the Montessori method, so
Sure.
there is that kind of caveat there. But Dr. Montessori was, she was a physician, she was the first female physician in Italy, and she was an anthropologist, and she studied children in a very unique way. She observed them, and she observed their natural tendencies, and she observed them all over the world using methods that had been used by psychologists previous to her work that she ended up building upon. And she developed a method that many people have not heard of, or if they have heard of it, they don't know really what it is. And it's not easy to describe. In fact, there's a contest right now in the Montessori world to come up with a 30-second elevator speech, because the method is so complex and so profound that it's very difficult to describe in a short period of time. But it really answers a lot of the questions that are being asked here.
Okay, do you have a 30-second elevator?
I'm trying to come up with it
Well-
on the top of my head, honestly.
Well, you're in the business, Elaine, you're a student in the Montessori schools, you have a 30-second.
Organized homeschooling.
Basically, it is.
Children work at their own.
They work at their own pace. They work on what they're interested in. And it actually, there's a misconception that Montessori is a very unstructured environment, but it's actually a very structured environment. It's structured for the individual child. And one of the main premises behind Montessori is that it's about building independence and a sense of competence in the children. That they have the sense that they can take care of themselves and that they can take care of others and that they can contribute to a community. It's more than just academic education. It's educating the entire personality of the child. It's allowing them to get a sense of just life. And so typically it starts at age 3, and children are known to learn to write and read starting around age 4.
That's good.
And it's a very natural method. And at the elementary level, it's based on this idea called cosmic education. I'll just try to go into it really quickly. It's giving the child a framework of actually the entire universe from the very beginning. There are these stories that are told to the children that really engage their interest, and it automatically plants seeds in them that get them interested in science, in history, math, language. It's a beautiful, beautiful program, and so if anyone has any questions.
Thank you. You got to cut about 80 seconds off that, and you've got it, but that's a great start. That's a great start.
I think
Yes, sir.
Scott wants to ask a
I had a
question.
Yes,
question.
sir.
I had a great female mentor that passed away, but she told me 2 things. She said, never align yourself with a negative campaign, and she said, I was trying to choose between public and private school, and to stay married, I did what my wife wanted.
That's correct.
She said it's all about parent participation, not whether it's public or private. And when you talked about the homeschool being 30% greater, it piqued my interest, along with a correlation of the 4th through 12th. So if over time they get ranked less, what was the highest correlation? Is it due to the high divorce rate maybe?
No.
What was the highest correlation of why we fall apart from 4th through 12th?
Consensus on what to do in the early grades and how to teach. Decoding text, numeracy, basic literacy, and then it kind of falls apart about what to do next and how to teach it. Math, real disagreements about how to teach math, how to teach the other disciplines. By the way, since you asked a question, this is a great donor to the University of Texas, a man who gives of himself to this university, and he is to be much honored for that. His interest in this place is selfless, and all he asks is that people recognize that the country needs to give back occasionally and to recognize what makes the country work. So I think that's the answer, Scott. There is consensus on the early grades and about what should go on, relative consensus. And then things tend to fall apart in terms of educational theory and practice. And the subjects are simply not taught at the level of depth that's needed. The NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, is a national exam. It's an assessment. They don't test every student, but they test students in every state, most districts. It's a sample, and it's the best test that's given. And I beefed it up when I was Secretary of Education. I hired two prominent people at the time to be chair and co-chair, the governor of Tennessee, Lamar Alexander, and the wife of the governor of Arkansas, Hillary Clinton, and asked them to make sure this was a much stronger instrument. It is a much stronger instrument. It's the best test we have. And not to be negative, but I got one of the questions from an NAEP 15 years ago. 35% of high school juniors could not convert 35% to a fraction. Now that's a problem. That's a problem in a world economy. So you got to do a lot better than that. In the 4th grade, they're doing pretty well, and then we just lose ground. We just lose ground. Now, when I became Secretary of Education, they said if you could wave a wand, we're doing something right, that the crowd's getting bigger.
Yeah, this is great.
I'm just going to go to 8 o'clock. I don't care. No, I'm not. I'm kidding.
He said it.
No. When I became Secretary of Education, someone said if you could wave a wand and improve American education, what's the one thing you do? What would you institute or get rid of? I said I would get rid of puberty. And they said, it just sounds like a conservative, there they go again, anti-sex, anti-everything. I said, I'm kidding. I said, but puberty is this distraction. Have you ever been in a middle school? They vibrate. Buildings actually vibrate from the hormonal energy that's going on. It's life. So that's a problem. Scott, being 13 is a problem. There are distractions. Were you ever 13? No, don't tell stories.
I'm 14 right now.
I know you do, but it's a problem.
So we have a lot more hands.
I know.
People, and this lady has been waiting quite a while. Then I'm going to head to the back. We'll go a few more minutes.
If we had no puberty and driverless cars, we'd be smart.
But you've been waiting patiently, ma'am. Thank you.
What
Yes,
is
ma'am.
Massachusetts doing right, and can it be taught to the other states?
Yeah. It pains me to say Massachusetts is doing so many things right. It's not my favorite place. But anyway, they're doing this right. It was chairman of an education commission, a guy named John Silver, who came out of the University of Texas, who ran for governor of Massachusetts. He was president of Boston University. And Bill Weld asked him, Bill Weld was the governor, and asked him to be chairman of this education commission. And they got a very tough commission. He was Democrat. Democrats and Republicans. And they said, we're going to have very high standards. And we're going to test all the students. But first, we're going to test all the teachers. And we will increase teacher pay, but we're testing all the teachers. And if you don't pass the test, you don't get to teach. The first year they gave the test, 46% of the teachers failed. Bam. Boy, that was a shock to the system. But they did it. They worked their way through it. And there's an article by, is it Amanda Ripley, Chris, I think in Atlantic last year, about Massachusetts and all the things they did. Also, City Journal was written about that. Very tough standards, very high achieving, and they continue to do well. It's not that complicated.
So, a lady in the back. Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
It's also cold.
I was wondering about your view of the role of language in education policy. I know she had mentioned some things, but I'm wondering why more schools aren't teaching in people's native languages or in the local dialects, if this wouldn't help them to achieve better.
I think that actually the research is going the other way. I think people are saying keep your language, keep your dialect, keep your language of your home or your home country if you're an immigrant, but learn English in the United States. The studies are overwhelming that if you want to succeed, if you want upward mobility, you speak English well, fluently, and it's increasingly the language of the international language of business too. It's just a fact. And it's facility in language is a great thing. I marvel at people. There's the lady with whom we had breakfast who speaks 5 languages. I have a couple. I did Latin and German for my PhD. Latin doesn't come in handy in restaurants, but it's okay. Yeah, I think that's true. But go ahead.
Do you about the core reading to be taught first? That's the most important thing. Couldn't they teach that in the original language while teaching English on the side?
Well, you could if you knew it, if you could do both. But again, when I was there in the office, we commissioned this. There was huge debates about bilingual then. They've kind of settled down now, but the overwhelming evidence was that the best way for kids to get the best jobs, have the best employment possibilities, best university admissions was to get fast on that language as quickly and as early as possible, and to keep the native language. And the quicker and faster you learn that new language and maintain the native language, the better you get in both.
Nadia, this is one of my students, so watch out.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just to follow up on that. What is your take on the teaching of foreign languages in elementary schools?
I don't care. I don't think it's critical, but I think it's fine as an elective. Math, English, history, science, art, and music. Why? It's not my bias. That's, I think, what the research shows. It's what makes you smarter, makes you more educated, more confident, leads you to better colleges, better jobs, and more career and life satisfaction. But I think learning a foreign language is a great thing. I don't think it's essential. I know it sounds terrible to some people, but I don't think it is.
Yes, sir.
Hi, you hear so many teachers complain about the fact that they are kind of restricted by what goes on in their classroom because of their requirement to teach the state curriculum and that restricted nature of it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it depends on the state curriculum. I don't think they're that restrictive. There's a funny kind of cliche out there about teachers objecting to teaching to the test. You have to teach to the test. I do think there are too many tests. I think there should be fewer tests and better tests. I think there are some good tests out there. I think Iowa's a pretty good test. NAEP is a great test. I'd like to see NAEP used more often. Almost everybody who's done it, psychometricians, everybody thinks it's a great test. But the notion of teaching to the test, if that means you give the answers to the kids ahead of time, I don't think you should do that, because that doesn't measure anything. But if you teach the ability to, reason through those problems and work your way through, or understand these concepts, and they do well, I think that's just fine.
A few more. You've been writing.
Life's a test, series of tests.
If we could kind of shift a little bit to school climate,
Yeah,
right, in light of all the recent.
in light of our climate discussion earlier.
That combined with all the budget cuts to school counselors, we've got one counselor covering 10 schools and no mandatory coverage for mental health within our insurance policies. Kind of, what is kind of the state of the union, if you will, on measuring school climate?
Well, I think it's very serious. School climate issues are very serious, and schools are going shorthanded on a lot of fronts. I think this requires a tightening up of the ship in terms of the disciplines. I was mentioning the Illinois example. And I think it requires other institutions to do more. Look, I got enormous sympathies for the schools and teachers who are being asked to do everything. Kids are often dropped off at 7, even earlier in some places, picked up at 5:30. And people are being expected to do everything. My sister-in-law's a counselor and works a 12, 14-hour day. Way too big a load. But you know what she's doing? She's making up for the breakdown of the American family is what she's doing. And if, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the Democrat I mentioned earlier, when they asked him after 40 years of service, what's the biggest change you've seen in America and the Western world, he said, the collapse of the American family. He said, it makes a big difference. You may like it, you may not like it. But families are the first best original Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And when it goes, other institutions have to pitch in. You know when I found this out? Partly in the education job, partly in the drugs our job. When I'm at the other end of the pipe. The judges say, here, I'm the guy who says to some guy, didn't anybody ever teach you nursery right and wrong? And he said, the young men say to me, no, sir. You know what? He said, I believe him. I believe nobody ever did. So that's a big price, and we throw a lot of that burden on the schools, and it's not right. James Q. Wilson, a guy I admire very much, social scientist who just died, said, society has to decide who's going to carry the burden of the children. We're going to raise them, we're going to have everybody raise them, we're going to have families raise them, and neighborhoods raise them, and schools raise them, or we're going to slough it off to somebody else. And if we keep sloughing it off, you better be ready to have more institutions like Boys Town and other places.
Yes, sir.
I think that's right.
Yeah, I work for a program called City Year. I was a core member with them.
With who?
Last year. City Year.
Okay.
Stationed many different cities.
City Year, you said?
City Year, yes. And they work on getting students back on track to graduate from high school. And one of the key ways they do that is through behavior initiatives and trying to get through, because in the 6th and 9th grade, that's one of the things that can kind of track which students are prepared and which are not prepared to graduate from high school. And I'm just wondering what you think the future of discipline in schools is, specifically with regard to suspensions, which, my understanding is they're
focused on, in a way, punishing the parent, but in many cases, with the fall of the family in America, the parent isn't home anymore.
Well, that's that's related to this last question. That's a school climate question. And, I mean, a lot of people, like the Amy Weissnerias of the world, principal of the school in Chicago, will tell you that so much of her time is spent, on these kinds of things, basic discipline. And they will tell you, as my friend Joe Clark told me in Paterson, New Jersey, and another friend in Cleveland at elementary school in East Cleveland, he said, I got to do everything. He said, I want to teach math and English. I got to do mittens, and I got to do winter coats, and I got to do, don't punch people in the nose. So it's very hard. The future discipline will be a function of what the kids come in with. And if they come in with very little, the school will have to do more, or as much as it can.
Bill, is that really new, Dr. Bennett, excuse me, is that really new? I mean, because my grandmother was a child of immigrants and went to Julie Richmond High School in New York, and that's what she describes school being like. She describes juvenile delinquency and kids showing up hungry with, one parent was still in Russia, one parent was here. How different is this?
Diane Ravitch writes about the New York City schools, and she says that the deprivation was severe, the poverty was severe, but the expectation is that you would succeed. And for the teachers, they could count on the parents saying, you listen to the teacher, you do what the teacher tells you to do. And not so sure anymore. They may come in with a lawyer or not pay any attention at all. If you listen to the beleaguered counselors and teachers now, they'll tell you a very different story than one or two generations. My grandparents, each of my grandparents from a different country in Europe, England, Germany, Ireland, Hungary, and I remember just hearing from the grandparents I knew, there's tremendous respect for teachers and teaching. You do with teachers, the principal. My brother was in trouble all the time, so he became a lawyer. And Bill Clinton's lawyer, and he was in trouble all the time. And I remember my grandmother saying, "You can never disrespect the teacher." Teachers would love to hear that today. They don't hear that so often.
Fair enough. Mrs. Bennett.
Well, I just wanted to respond to the young man who asked about suspensions, because I have a program in the DC Public Schools here, and I'm amazed because at the incredible rate of suspensions. Most of my students, and this is a special program for character, and they're kind of the cream of the crop, but when I ask them, have you been suspended, 25% of the boys, and more of the girls now, it's up to about 21%. And so I started looking at it. The problem with suspensions is that the students are sent home, they miss class for 3 and 4 days. There's no parent there, so they're either doing video games or messing around, or they're on the streets getting in trouble. And what they do at the Catholic school, because my boys both went there, and when they're in trouble...
Hear that locution, my boys.
Yeah, well, our boys.
Our boys.
They have in-school suspension. And I think that is a much better, where you're going over to a room or a jug, where you spent some time.
Jug is justice under God in Catholic school.
The jug kids,
old school.
Who had really either acted badly or their work had slipped significantly, and so they were not sent out of the school building. They were in the school building. So suspensions have become a way of getting the bad kids out so nobody has to bother with them, but it doesn't work. And kids who are suspended tend to get suspended more and more. And it's a means of trying to get, I guess, order, but it's not a successful.
But it's not successful because it sacrifices the student for the order. Classroom Management Handbook of 1910, your question, Charles Bagley, it was the textbook for administrators. The first thing in your classroom, get order. Remember, the principal is with you, the school board is with you, the parents are with you, the community is with you. Not anymore. Not anymore. Now, we sent our boys to Catholic schools because we believe we're Catholics, and we like their philosophy. It was a kind of Catholic Sparta. They read, they run, they write, they play, they pray, and they came home exhausted, which is the way we like boys, exhausted, to avoid trouble, which we did some anyway. But it was important to us, the whole ethos of the school. But they have a real advantage. They can do things that the public schools can't do. And so, but they turn this alternative suspension. We can't handle it, just, toss him out. I remember a conference, a very moving conference with kids who'd suffered all sorts of horrible problems. And this teacher stood up and said, sometimes, I'll never forget this, what a kid needs more than anything else is a hug. And the counselor stood up and said, don't you dare hug that student. How many lawyers do you want on you? What a thing, you can't hug a kid, but counsel, the advice is probably right.
Speaking of hugs, the student I hug, Mark, come on.
The focus. This guy?
Yeah.
He's a Marine, you watch yourself.
He needs a hug once in a while, don't you?
We're cuddly sometimes.
What?
We're cuddly sometimes.
Cuddly. Okay. I'm stepping out of this.
The discussion thus far has been focused on K through 12 education.
Yes, sir.
This was a recent topic of debate amongst my friends and I was. The idealized track has been, you go to elementary school, middle school, high school, perform well, and then you go on to get a 4-year degree in, Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science. To what extent should we maybe be looking at a more robust, associate's degree system, community colleges, where people can go pursue, high skill, high wage, more blue collar jobs, rather than having this idealized system of funneling everyone into, a 4-year liberal arts college?
Yeah. That vocabulary, robust, funneling. It's Marines. It's the modern Marine. You can't go to the Navy. You can't go to the Marines, man, with that vocabulary. It's great. Yes, great question. And the answer is yes. Look, I think you may have a bubble in American higher education. I was reading the governor of North Carolina recently made some comments about higher education. He got in trouble with the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. It's back and forth. So I was reading down in the comment section on the page, and all these students who graduates of the system, not all of them, but about 80% of them, were taking the governor's side, saying, he's right, it's got to be more practical minded. I am unemployed, or I'm waiting tables, and I owe $48,000. What the heck was this all about? Well, we're in a very bad economic time, as we know, and that happens there, but there's more and more of this. So people are saying, does it make sense? The book we've got coming out in May talks about this, and a lot of charts and graphs, but people need to make tougher decisions than they used to because of the price, because of what it costs you, and because there's no guarantee that when you get out, you're going to get this job. Now, there's a lot of interesting numbers. The difference between a high school graduate and college graduate is $1 million over your lifetime. But who gets that $1 million? There's some pretty strong evidence that most of that $1 million accrued in the bank accounts of the graduates of the University of Texas and about 100 other institutions, and not the other places. So that can make a difference too if you want to do a sheer economic analysis. Look, I'm a classic liberal arts guy with a PhD in philosophy. I think you know why I think you should go to college? To save your soul and enlarge your mind. When's the last time you heard that? Okay, nobody's heard. All right, fine. That's what I think. Matthew Arnold, the best that's been thought and said. That's what you should go for. That's what I went for. And my mother said, what are you doing? I said, I'm getting a graduate PhD in philosophy. And she said, why? And I said, I don't know. That's what I'm working on. That's why I'm in philosophy. Give me a few years. I'll come up with it. So I was at Wagner Hall last year with my son, and I saw the job board. And there were no jobs on the job board for the philosophy majors. The only thing up there was a Bureau of Labor Statistics notice about the minimum wage. I said, oh man, things are bad. And I saw some guy got in the elevator. I said, you in the PhD program here at Texas? He said, yeah. I said, I got my PhD here. He said, how's it working out for you? I said, pretty good. He said, good for you. That was it. That was our conversation. You got to take a hard look. Look, 17 million jobs coming up in the next 5 years, which will require more than a high school degree, but not a college degree. So you got to look at it. And you got to look at what the jobs are. If you're telling me, your little brother, says, I don't know whether to go to college or not, but I love petroleum engineering, and I just got into Harvey Mudd. Get that kid to Harvey Mudd in petroleum engineering. He's going to graduate and get $160,000 a year. It's not the best thought and said, but it's a good start.
I think we're going to let this lady have the last question.
Well, thank you.
I'd like, first of all, to thank you, because my
You're
parents decided to homeschool me about, I don't know how many years ago, and your book on the Book of Virtues was very influential on
thank
learning
you.
the kinds of
Thank
things
you.
that they taught me.
Thank you.
And I'm now teaching for the Center for Cortex and Ideas here at,
Great.
at UT. And, oh my goodness, the question's going through my head, I'm nervous. Okay, but I actually have a theory as to why homeschoolers are doing that, have done better even than private and public school kids, and I think part of that might have something to do with the fact that they're given not just content, but honest assessment. I'm concerned, as I think I've noticed a lot of our discussion has been about how to help the lower rung, kind of middle rung people, but the upper rung students are constantly being, you gotta get to medical school, you gotta get to law school, and so there's this kind of loop of grade inflation and cheating and concern that if you don't, you might hurt a student's prospects. But I'm noticing that their ability to write is getting worse and worse and worse, and no one's telling them. If you don't tell a student, no, you will not get an A in my class if you don't write well, they're not going to learn how to write. I'm curious if maybe you've written on any of that in your new book on higher education.
No, but you're right. Well, I mean, no one's going to be as honest with you as your mom until you get married. I was, can I end with a funny story? I don't know. The answer to your question is yes. So the interesting things about homeschoolers. First of all, you can't pay a person enough to do what a parent will do at once. And it's endless. It's just endless. They'll just do it again and again and again. Second, a lot of parents, they don't just homeschool. They homeschool, and then you go to high school. The guy sitting next to you did homeschooling. Second, right?
Yeah, all of high school.
All of high school was homeschooled, and he was in institutions early. And but the other thing is confidence level with adults. And writing requires a lot of patience, a lot of time. Now, one thing the technology is doing, I won't say it's apparent, but the technology can be infinitely patient. I was co-founder of something called K-12. One thing I learned from special education is the IEP, the Individualized Education Program. And that's what a parent does for a child, does an IEP. Parents know a child, Joe's good in this, he's not so good in that, Tommy's good in this, not so good in that. We'll go quicker here, slower here, because of the child's ability. Parents have radar about that, because they know their children. The technology can be taught to do that too, so it tells you what you're doing. And, the technology assessments, when you're doing math, can tell you you're making the same mistake over and over again. It can tell you what that is, and of course, it's infinitely patient. When I was teaching our boys Saxon math, I was the Secretary of Education, as my wife pointed out. When she said, my sons, people said, well, you're the Secretary of Education. Where do you send your kids to school? I said, I don't have a vote in our house. That's Mrs. Bennett. I do wholesale. And she but I got my sons through math. When they did the problems when I was on the road, I just called them, and we went through the math problems wherever I was. When I was at home, I'd do it in my room, and my wife came up and said, is your theory of learning that the louder you yell at the child, the more he's likely to learn? That volume makes for clarity.
Works in sports.
Yeah, it works in sports. It doesn't work in math. But you know what? There's a stage in a boy's life, I don't know about girls, but a stage in a boy's life when a coach can tell them to eat dirt and they'll think it makes sense. And their father, whatever he says, may not make sense. It's a stage. It lasts about 14 years. But nevertheless, that engagement and that involvement is critical. But it's the same factors, whether it's the technology, whether it's the homeschool, or whether it's Jaime Escalante, that dedicated teacher. That's why I'm glad this research has showed the importance and effectiveness of a teacher to be so great. When I went on the tour, last story, I went to the 4th grade at Emma Kahn Elementary School in Raleigh, North Carolina. I was in the Reagan administration. I said, are there any questions? And this little guy raised his hand. And he said, when you sit around at meetings of the cupboard with President Reagan, you all really eat Jelly Bellies. And the little girl whispered, it's not the cupboard, it's the cabinet. It's the cabinet. And I said, the little girl corrected him. I said, young man, what just happened to you will be happening to you for the rest of your life. I said, yes. I said, President Reagan has a bowl of jelly beans. He passes them around. We've all had some. And his kid said, "You've had more than some." So the difficulty of being second ed when you go into school is that if you get somebody like this, you know, you lead the evening news.
Yeah.
Secretary of Education was embarrassed by little Eric Larrabee today. And that happened more than once. But you know, if the Soviet Minister of Education had been in the classroom, it wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
There's not an 8-year-old in the Soviet Union who would have said, "Hey, you ate all the jelly beans, man." You know, it's not a free place. And so I was glad for the embarrassment.
And that, if I might, is a note I wanted to make too. I mean, I want to thank our dean, Randy Deal, and others who've made this event possible. To me, the liberal arts is about having these kinds of discussions.
Yes, sir.
And there are too many people out there, I think, who are saying, well, we should talk about things one way or another. To me, this is what the liberal arts is all about. I want to thank Dr. Bennett for joining us and stimulating.